probably not as exciting to some of you folks. So I'm sure most of you work on the weekend. I worked my way through college, so I understand if you do. On Wednesday, we were talking about the newspaper war between Hearst and Pulitzer and the revolution in Cuba. And that's funny, that does not look like the revolution in Cuba, does it? Unless I've been lied to. But here we have. That looks a little more like the left. And remember, when American newspapers finally got interested in it, the thing was winding down. The Spanish had already largely repressed. But that's not going to stop Pulitzer and Hearst from making a huge story out of it in the American newspapers, at least in their two newspaper chains. So they're going to feature the revolution, stir up the American public, and basically provoke the U.S. government declaring war. They're also goading President William McKinley to declare war. And here's McKinley. In response, in January of 1898, McKinley does relent a little bit and sends the U.S. Navy's USS Maine to Cuba. It was allegedly to protect American interest against rioting, anti-American rioting there. And contrary to what you might hear, the battleship, it's what we call an armored cruiser. It was part of that new Navy I talked about that we began rebuilding in the 1880s. The Maine was built in 1886. And by 1898, it was no longer a frontline ship, by the way. Here it is. Still formidable, but. So that's going to sit in Havana Harbor for a little bit. A month later, on February 9th, the New York Journal steals a letter, out of the U.S. mail, I might add, written by Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Duque de Puy de Lome. Now, the Foreign Minister de Lome, in his letter, and by the way, this was a private letter. He was not writing in his capacity as a Spanish Foreign Minister. What he was doing was venting to a friend in the letter. But he was complaining about the Americans being aggressive. He called McKinley weak and said if the Americans ever attacked Cuba, Spain would defeat them. What do you expect the Spanish? Well, this gets printed on the front page of the Journal and the rest of Hearst newspapers around the country. How's that for an embarrassment for McKinley and yet another thing to goading towards war? By the way, it's totally unfair to the loan. Oh well. Missing a cartoon I had up there. Now, a few days later, on the 15th of February, about 9:40 p.m. that evening, without any warning, the Maine spontaneously explodes. I mean, explodes. 268 officers and men of the 328-man crew are killed. And I want to point out that most of the survivors were saved by Spanish ships that risked their lives darting in and out of the flaming wreckage to rescue the Americans. Having said that, without any evidence whatsoever, none, zero, the U.S. Consul General in Havana, Fitzhugh Lee, telegraphs Washington and said the Spanish have just blown up the Maine. By the way, since Cuba was not an independent country, we didn't have an ambassador to it. So a consul general is basically the next step down. It's our official diplomatic representative of that country. Now, Fitzhugh Lee probably blamed the Spanish, without any evidence, for a couple of reasons. One, there were a lot of Americans eager for war with Spain, for reasons I will detail in a few minutes. But like a lot of Americans, particularly white Southerners, they believed a good foreign war is what we were needed to heal the wounds of the Civil War. Let's go out and beat the crap out of somebody together, and that'll bring us together, right? I'm being a little cynical, but that was the approach. This is the era, folks, that they were basically beginning to, to put it bluntly, lie about the Civil War and what it was all about. They're beginning to downplay the fact that it was all about slavery and the liberation of 4 million Americans. And all of a sudden it becomes a brotherly struggle over states' rights. And by the way, this is when all the Confederate statues started popping up all over the place. Had nothing to do with history. It had to do with propaganda, presenting a false image of what was going on, and reinforcing white supremacy. The white supremacists had taken political power in the South again, and those statues were a reminder to the black community who was in charge. It had nothing to do with history. Nothing. And by the way, this is a typical advertisement, poster, whatever, illustrating what I was talking about. So you've got a Union soldier and a Confederate soldier, and they're both patriots. I'm not sure how committing treason, firing on your own flag is being a patriot. But at any rate, that was a driving force. And by the way, here's what's left of the Maine after the explosion. Just a tangled mess, basically. Now, Fitzhugh Lee wasn't the, by the way, that last name sound familiar? Yeah. He was Robert E. Lee's nephew. So that should give you a little hint, too, about what his ulterior motives might have been. He's not the only one to rush to judgment. A U.S. court of inquiry reached the same conclusion, that a Spanish torpedo had blown up the Maine. And by the way, back then when they said torpedo, they actually mean what we call a mine today. The modern day torpedo hadn't really been perfected yet. The British are in the process of doing that. So when they said torpedo, they basically mean a mine. Now, the Navy will actually hold a second inquiry years later, once war fever died down, and said they couldn't determine what had blown it up. But finally, in 1976, they found the answer. Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarine fleet, apparently had a few spare moments when he was Chief of Naval Operations and convened yet a third inquiry into the sinking of the Maine. It's always been a bit of a thorn to the Navy, what really happened. And guess what they concluded sunk the Maine? And this is almost undoubtedly the real cause. What do you think blew it up? Yes?
Like the coal stuff within the ship, like combusted.
Way to go. Thank you. Yeah. Remember, these ships are coal-fired. They had emptied the coal bunkers next to the boilers. So all they had left in them was coal dust. You know anything about coal dust? It's highly explosive, very flammable. You got a hot boiler, steel walls, and the coal dust. It apparently superheated the room and caused an explosion. And that's not far-fetched because it happened in every modern Navy back then. The British had a battleship blow up, a much larger ship do the same thing, and it happened to the French on more than one occasion. This ship had been badly designed. The coal bunkers should not have been right next to the boilers. You know why they put them there? Yeah, thank you, convenience. You want to shovel coal across the room? So anyway, that's probably what blew it up. It was an accident. But we didn't really care at that point what done it. We were looking for a reason to blame the Spanish and start a war. And by the way, the ship itself, after the Spanish-American War, was towed out to sea and given a proper official burial at sea. That's what you do with warships like that. It was given a 21 salute and everything and taken out to sea and sunk. But there is a memorial to it at Arlington National Cemetery. This is the mast from the Maine. So there's a nice monument to it at Arlington. And to show a typical newspaper headline, to show you how at least some of the newspapers were, oh gee, what do you know, it's the New York Journal, what a shock. Crisis is at hand, Spanish treachery. Mm-hmm. Now, McKinley was an expander. He was an imperialist at heart, and many of his closest advisors were. Alfred Thayer Mahan, remember him? Elihu Root, John Hay, the Secretary of State, and one of the most vocal and aggressive was the Assistant Secretary of State, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. So McKinley's getting pressured from his own advisors to declare war. McKinley was a former Union officer. He had been a general during the Civil War. In fact, he'll be the last of the Civil War veterans to serve as president. There had been a string of them. He would be the last. McKinley had seen combat. He had seen war firsthand. It also saved Abraham Lincoln's life. The Confederates were bombarding, at one point, the fortifications of Washington, D.C., and Lincoln, who was kind of a hands-on commander-in-chief, was actually out in the trenches, seeing what was going on, getting the first-hand look. And McKinley didn't know who he was at that point. He was crouching down like any smart person would. Saw Lincoln standing up and just grabbed him and pulled him down and said, "Get down, you stupid son of a bitch." And then realized it was the President of the United States. So, and by the way, Lincoln appreciated it. He didn't court-martial him or anything. But the whole point is McKinley had seen war. And he replied to the warmongers, quote, I have seen the bodies piled up. I do not want to see it again, end quote. So McKinley's going to resist the drive towards war, but it's not going to do any good. His own advisors, his own military, the press, and popular opinion are all going to force him in to a decision to declare war. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't Congress have the right to declare war, not the president?
Yes, but the president has to request it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's that, balance of power thing.
Yeah.
He has to request it, they have to approve it.
Okay.
Yeah, good question, thank you. Now, thank God, neither body can just declare it unilaterally. Even though presidents have exercised way too much power sometimes when it comes to stuff like Vietnam War is a good example. So he's going to get pulled into war. In March of 1898, McKinley issues an ultimatum to Spain, demanding an immediate armistice with the rebels. They have to agree to talks with the rebels, and if the talks don't bear fruit by October 1st, agree to America arbitrating a decision. We never actually bother to tell Spain that the crux of the issue is Cuban independence. We don't even bother to communicate our key negotiating point to them. We just give them an ultimatum. Spain actually accepts the terms. But we didn't like that. We were ready for one war anyway, so it doesn't do any good. But they do accept the terms. On the 9th of March, Congress authorizes a $50 million military appropriation, which today is nothing. They probably just spent $50 million in the time it took me to say they just spent $50 million. But back then, that was a hell of a lot of money. That would be several hundred million today, if not more. On the 11th of April, McKinley does not ask for a declaration of war, but instead asks Congress for authorization to use force as a neutral to secure, quote, a rational compromise between both sides in Cuba. Do you see the inherent contradiction in that statement, folks? Why is that a bit absurd? What's the contradiction in that statement?
Using force.
As a neutral, yeah. If you use force, guess what? You're no longer a neutral, are you? And the term rational compromise can mean many, many things, can it? But the very fact that McKinley's authorized to use force, we're not neutral anymore. We've taken a side. It's our side, not necessarily the rebel side, by the way, as I'll point out. On the 19th of April, 8 days later, Congress declares Cuba free. That was damn nice of them, wasn't it? Yeah, we don't own it, we don't control it, we never had any claim over it, but what the hell, we're going to declare it free. How would we have felt back then had Great Britain arbitrarily declared Hawaii free? Remember, we had just got our hands on that. I don't think we would have liked that. How do you think Spain felt? They also authorize the president to use force to remove Spanish authority. Not particularly neutral there, is it? But to show that we're only doing this because we have good intentions, and by the way, this does help down the road for Cuba anyway, Congress passes the so-called Teller Amendment. Oh, goody, we got covered chalk here. What are they reading that? Named after the guy who sponsored it. Basically, it said, even if the United States liberates Cuba, we will give it its independence. We will not turn it into a colony. So Congress is pretty much guaranteeing Cuban independence if we get involved. Keep in mind, independence means different things. But we're not going to make a direct colony out of it. Interestingly enough, we didn't recognize the rebel Cuban government. We were going in there to help the Cubans in the revolution. We probably should have recognized the government that was fighting that revolution, the Cuban revolutionaries, but we didn't do that. And 2 days later, on the 21st of April, McKinley declares a naval blockade on Cuba. Yes, John F. Kennedy in 1962 was not the first president to do that. Now, why is a blockade extremely provocative? What is it considered under international law? If you blockade another country, what's that considered? Unkind? Inconvenient? How about an act of war? Under international law, you blockade another country's coast, you pretty much declared war on them. On the 24th, 3 days later, declares war on the United States. And in a case of one-upmanship, the following day on the 25th, the United States declares war on Spain, claiming a state of war had existed since April 21st, when they declared the blockade, which was legally correct, but it was still kind of a case of one-upmanship. Nah, we declared war on you first. At any rate, whoever declared war, we're now at war with Spain, ostensibly over Cuba. Now, like almost any war or any event like this, there wasn't a single reason we go to war. It's usually a confluence of reasons. To begin with, the American public had a genuine humanitarian concern for the Cuban people. The government may have been cynical about it. They may see this as a land grab, but the average American really thought it was a worthy crusade. We're doing something to help an oppressed people. That's one reason the war was so popular. They really thought they were doing good. Secondly, and this gets a lot of guys in trouble in a lot of wars, adventure. For some strange reason, us guys, and now you ladies, have the naive opinion that war's adventurous, exciting. Actually, it's boring and sometimes terrifying. We were naive. This is 1898. When did the last major war end? The Civil War. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thank you. 33 years earlier. You're 2 for 2 today, thanks. Yeah, it ended in 1865. An entire generation had grown up not knowing the realities of war. And that's kind of sad because the Civil War was one of the bloodiest, in fact, it is the bloodiest to this day in American history. We lost more people in that war than we lost in World War II and World War I combined.
Yeah, we're fighting each other.
Oh yeah, that'll pile the casualties up a little bit.
People.
But it should have been an abject lesson to them, shouldn't have been? Yeah. And it's the first modern industrial war. So the casualties on the battlefield in that were horrific. Well, we forgot all that in the romanticism and the desire to bring the nation back together. We glorified it, similar to that cartoon I showed you. It's got a whole generation growing up with the mistaken idea that war is romantic and noble. Yeah, you sit in a muddy trench in 40-degree weather eating rotten food out of a can. That'll tell you how romantic war is. So adventure is going to goad a lot of young men into joining the military for this. And as I pointed out, there's Southern War is going to reunite North and South. And last but not least, and probably one of the more important driving reasons, was imperialism. This was a chance for the United States to take advantage of a decaying Spanish Empire and seize one of our own. The war was generally popular in the United States, overwhelmingly popular actually. But there is opposition to it. To begin with, world opinion. Great Britain, France, most other major nations all saw the United States as the aggressor, as having no reason to provoke a war. So, when you look at it internationally, we were seen as the bad guys. There's domestic opposition. Sam Clemens, you know him better by under his pseudonym, don't you? Mark Twain. Andrew Carnegie. Remember, he's a lifelong pacifist. Of course he opposes the war. The German-American reformer, Karl Schurz. And a young, well, not too young anymore, a rising politician that you're going to hear a lot about here, and four-time loser for the presidency, William Jennings Bryan, who also, by the way, was a lifelong pacifist. Those are just four notable Americans that opposed the war. And there were even some in Congress. One senator on the floor debates remarked that fighting Spain was the equivalent to robbing an old gypsy woman in a vacant lot at night after a fair. So basically, he's saying this is a mugging. Remember, Spain's a decaying power or a rising power. And here's a Leslie's Weekly, which is a very popular magazine back then. Gives you an idea how popular the war was. Call to arms. So we rush into the war with a whole lot of enthusiasm and virtually no planning or preparation. We were awfully damn lucky. We were fighting what was now a third-rate power. If it had been one of the first-rate powers, France, Britain, Germany, we would have had our rear end handed to us. begin with, when we declared war, the Army consisted of 26,000 men. Hardly a force large enough to conquer an empire, is it? So Congress passes the Mobilization Act, raises the size of the Army to 65,000 men, still a pittance, but authorizes a volunteer force of 125,000, which is soon raised to 200,000. Now, the volunteer units are raised by both Congress, the states, and individuals. If you were wealthy and connected, you could raise your own regiment, make yourself the commander of it, the colonel. This system dates back to the Civil War, and to put it bluntly, it sucks. It's highly inefficient, it's highly politicized, it leads to division of command, and thank God and luckily this will be the last war we suffer through that. All these different state and volunteer regiments hardly form an army. It's not particularly cohesive. Probably the most famous of the volunteer regiments, it's the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, better known as what? Oh, they're famous in history. Should have brought my cavalry sword in. The Rough Riders. Remember that? No idea. That's sad. The regiment was originally raised by a rising young star in the Army, Colonel Leonard Wood. He was politically connected, and they gave him permission to basically raise his own unit. He was already a colonel. That's the rank you need to command a regiment back then. Second in command, and the guy that will eventually take command of the unit, is the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Lieutenant Colonel Teddy Roosevelt. The 1,450 men in the Rough Riders, in the 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, were made up of Western cowboys, lawmen, Eastern athletes, and the sons of the privileged elite in the East. How do you get cowboys and Harvard graduates in the same regiment? Especially when it's a volunteer regiment. How does that happen? Teddy Roosevelt raised the regiment. He was a wealthy New Yorker. I'll talk about that probably next week when I talk about TR. But the family owned ranches out west. And TR loved it. He pretty much spent a lot of his life out west on a ranch. And he learned from real cowboys and real Western lawmen how to ride, how to shoot, how to use a lariat, the whole 9 yards. So he wasn't what some people back then would have called a dime store cowboy. You know, an Easterner that wanted to affect being a cowboy. Teddy Roosevelt really knew what the hell it was like. So when he put the regiment together, he tapped, in essence, both his lives. His privileged Eastern elite life, knowing all the sons of the privileged families, and his rough and tumble Western life. So you got this real kind of strange, combination in the Rough Riders. It worked greatly, strangely enough. Everybody got along well. They got a kick out of each other and grew to respect each other greatly. They were a great success. A lot of the other volunteer regiments were failures. And by the way, Teddy was terribly nearsighted. He wore really thick glasses, looked like the bottom of a pop bottle. And they weren't like our modern glasses made, out of something that's relatively indestructible. You drop them, they break. He's in battle on a horse. What's he going to do if his glasses break? This will tell you something about Teddy Roosevelt. When he goes into battle, his hat is lined with about 4 or 5 spare pairs of glasses. And when he loses one or they break, he just pulls down his spare. Tells you a lot about Teddy. The guy was a hoot. And by the way, here's some writers. And here's Teddy, or here's our good Colonel Wood. And here's Rough Rider Colonel Teddy Roosevelt. He was actually a good writer. The preparation for the assault on Cuba is marked by incompetence and bungling. Both the Army and Navy will be involved in this. The war will be fought on land and sea. There is no cooperation or coordination between the two branches. You didn't have a Defense Department back then. One overarching institution controlling both of them. You had a War Department and a Navy Department. And they didn't talk to each other that often. So you go into a war with no coordination between your two major branches of the armed forces. That's smart, isn't it? The War Department did not plan ahead or buy the necessary equipment, in part because Congress hadn't given them any money over the years. So when war breaks out, they have little spare equipment and no money initially to buy any. They had a few modern weapons. The regular soldiers were using the modern Krag Jorgensen rifle. It used smokeless powder. If you shot it, all you got was a little, well, you got a bullet, but all you got was a little puff of white smoke. And that meant if you're shooting at somebody from bushes or something like that, you're much better concealed. The volunteers are all going to be armed with old black powder Springfields. What happens when you pull the trigger on one of those things? Yeah, you get a big black cloud and everybody within a mile knows where you're at. Kind of hard to hide, conceal yourself. So we send a lot of our troops into battle with inferior weapons. The Army didn't have enough new uniforms, so they issued them old uniforms that had been in stock for 20, 30 years. Old woolen uniforms. See a problem with that? Where are they fighting? Yeah, they're fighting in a tropical environment, and they're in woolen uniforms. Can you say heat stroke? It's going to be a big problem. They finally do develop a tropical weight uniform at the very end of the war when everything's over. That's the Army for you. Get it done when it's over. They bring in some of the best soldiers in the Army to train the volunteers. Members of the 24th and 25th Infantry, and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. And collectively, they have a very famous nickname. Who are they? They're the famous Buffalo Soldiers. Back then, the Army was still segregated. These were the 4 African American regiments in the Army. Here's some Buffalo Soldiers. And they will serve with distinction, by the way, in Cuba, as I will demonstrate. But those 4 regiments were composed of some of the absolute best soldiers the U.S. Army had. They had won great fame for themselves out west. They're the ones that finally chased down Geronimo, the great Apache leader, for example. They send them to training camps in Macon, Georgia, and Tampa, Florida. And the white volunteers riot rather than be trained by the black regulars. These guys can teach you things that are going to save your butt on the battlefield, and racism gets in the way, and they won't let them train them. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. The military issued, or when they were loading the ships for Cuba, many of the rations that they were loading for the troops were 20 or 30 years old. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to eat anything coming out of a can that's been in there for 2 decades. Maybe a Twinkie, those things have a shelf life of what, 1,000 years or something? Those might be safe. But you really want to eat rations that have been canned a decade and a half, 20 years ago? Those actually weren't as bad as the fresh ones. The Army contracted with some of the meat packers to, basically pack pork and beef and all that for the troops. And in their hurry to make a ton of money off of this, they did not pack a lot of them correctly. The soldiers, especially the beef, they called it embalmed beef. Sounds delicious, doesn't it? Makes you hungry for lunch. You'd open the can and a lot of it would be this green slimy mess. And by the way, soldiers on the battlefield will sometimes eat damn near anything, and a lot of them ate it, and a lot of them died from it. It'll be a huge scandal after the war about wartime profiteering. So the embalmed beef is probably going to kill as many American soldiers as Spanish bullets. Yes, ma'am?
Was this before or after The Jungle was written?
This was before. This is a good example of why. Yeah. That's what always cracks me up when people talk about, useless government regulations and how it hinders business. I think of things like this. Because without them, this is what happens. People who think business, if they're out for anything but profits, they're naive, quite frankly. And that's just not an opinion. You study history, and that's the verdict. So, yes, regulation can be good, folks, if you don't want to open a can and find a green, slimy mess in it. Unless, of course, that's what it was labeled, and that's what you wanted. So, oh, good, green, slimy mess. Sorry. Now, they do pack some fresh fruits and vegetables for them. They're not stupid. They don't want them to live out of just canned products. And in their wisdom, they put that on the ships first. And then the ships sit in Tampa Harbor for about 2 weeks, 90-degree heat. So, what about our fresh fruit and vegetables when we get to Cuba?
Nice and rotten.
Yeah, it's gooey mess is all it is. Rotten. You catch the theme of what I'm talking about, how incompetent and stupid they were putting all this together? It's almost amazing we win the war. And as I pointed out, even though the war's over Cuba, and this will tell you the real reason for the war as far as McKinley's government, the first action of the war isn't in Cuba. It's half a world away. It's in the Philippines. What the Philippines have to do with Cuba, I still don't know. Aside from the fact they were both Spanish possessions, and there for the taking. Even before war was declared, in February of 1898, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, sent a telegraph to the commander of the U.S. Pacific Squadron, Commodore Thomas Dewey. Or George Dewey, I'm sorry. He said that in the event of hostilities, they were to take on coal and go seize the Philippines. By the way, Dewey's squadron, was 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats, was actually at Hong Kong. We didn't have any bases in the Pacific at that point. We didn't even have Pearl Harbor yet in Hawaii. On the 27th of April, under instructions from the government, Dewey leaves Hong Kong with Philippine revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo on board. The Philippine revolutionaries are under the impression the U.S. Navy and Marines are going to the Philippines to liberate the Philippines and give them their independence. They will be sadly mistaken. So we're going to use Aguinaldo and the rebels to get what we want, and then we're going to turn on them. By the way, that'll lead to a bloody 4-year war after the Spanish-American War. One you probably never even heard of. It's known as the Philippine Insurrection. The Spanish-American War will last a good 4 months. The insurrection will last 4 years. By the way, once we declared war, could Dewey have remained in Hong Kong? No. Under international law, a belligerent warship cannot remain in a neutral port for more than 48 hours after war has been declared. Had those ships remained there, the British would have been fully in their rights to seize the ships. And by the way, had they wanted to do it, they were also fully capable of doing it. Luckily for Dewey, the British commander at Hong Kong was friendly, and in violation of international law, he allowed them to take on coal and take their time getting ready to leave the port. But theoretically, the British could have interned the ships. And in reality, there was little we could have done about it, quite frankly. So he leaves Hong Kong, sails to the Philippines, and on May 1st fights the Battle of Manila Bay with the Spanish fleet guarding the Philippines. Battle begins at 5 a.m. Now, why do people want to start hostilities so darn early in the morning? I mean, don't you want to get up, have some coffee, maybe a little breakfast first, before you start killing people? All jokes aside, why, especially back then, do most battles start before dawn? Thank you. Way to go. You got to maximize daylight back then. So most offensives, most battles, usually start right around dawn. You don't know how long they're going to take, do you? By the way, we don't have to worry about that anymore. With all our technology, we own the night. Anymore, the United States prefers to attack at night because it's a huge advantage for us. You don't remember the first Iraq War, do you? It was all over. I mean, you could watch most of it on CNN. It was the best daytime show ever. But when we launched that war, our initial strikes were all at night, in the dead of night. And they were extremely effective, I might add. But back then, you tried to maximize daylight. So Dewey attacks at 5 a.m. Battle doesn't last all that long. It's over by 10. And that's even after Dewey took a break for breakfast about halfway through. All 10 Spanish ships were sunk or destroyed. They were antiquated compared to Dewey's more modern ships. By the way, this is Dewey's big moment in history. He's going to make the history books. And luckily for him, it'll make him an admiral too. He gets promoted right after the battle. You know, great moment in history. And what does he say to immortalize it when he starts the battle? He turns to the captain of his flagship, the Olympia, and says, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." Those are stirring words, aren't they? It's not like one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So in a 5-hour battle, we destroy all 10 Spanish ships, kill 381 Spanish sailors. American losses, really no damage to our ships, 8 wounded and 1 dead. And our single casualty died of a heart attack right before the battle started. Wasn't even a combat casualty. It's one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. Dewey will go on to great fame and get his promotion to Rear Admiral, I might add. Here's his flagship, the Olympia. Gridley, though, won't get any great fame out of this. Not that he didn't deserve it in a promotion, but unfortunately he was sick. He'll die a month later from disease. And given the clock on the wall, we're finished the war on Monday.